Hello everyone, hope you're well. So this week we turn to bodies and, to be more specific, how living in a human body comes to affect our well-being. So it's important to remember that well-being isn't a purely intellectual endeavour. The psychology of well-being is also about feelings and emotions, and it's one of the few areas of psychology that really tries to kind of bridge that gap and connect with that kind of feeling experience. So in this lecture I'll be talking about how do we know what it is that we feel. Okay, so when we're filling in our well-being questionnaires or whatever, the PANAS, whatever it might be, how do we know what those experiences are that we're feeling? Okay, how do we know what those emotions are? And then I'll also be looking at how do we deal with difficult feelings and emotions, okay, and what do we know about where those arise in human bodies? And then I'll be moving on to this notion of emotional intelligence, so looking at how do we learn to control some of the feelings that we experience? How is that part of being human? And how can we foster well-being in others, understanding the feelings that others have? And how can we encourage positive well-being as a feeling experience? And then finally, I'll be looking at some of the different factors in everyday life that impact on our experience of well-being through feelings. Okay, so what are those kind of global factors like the weather, food, exercise, etc., illness? How do all of these things come to bear on well-being? Okay, so I'll see you in a minute with the slides. So the mind-body connection is really an important dilemma for psychologists. And in the early days of psychology, if you think of early theorists like Descartes, there was this idea that the mind and body were in some way separate, okay, that the body acted almost like a machine, that it sort of did its own thing, and then the mind existed in this kind of strange separate domain. And we see some of that, the legacy of Descartes' thinking in cognitive psychology. But as time's gone on, we've realised that it's not really possible to separate out the mind and the body, that's a really simplistic way of thinking about what's going on, and that really when we're talking about well-being, we need to understand how the body operates and how it impacts the way the mind understands experience. Okay, so we shouldn't think of emotional states and feelings as something somehow disconnected from the body. The body is as an essential and central part of cognition. Okay, so lots of research in embodied cognition really kind of follows this through. So in this lecture I'll be looking at what do we know about how the body feeds into our experience of well-being. So when we are asked how do we feel, that classic question, how are you today? How do we make sense of that? So we are starting by referring to some kind of physical sensation, some feeling state that comes from the body, and somehow we interpret that, and as we grow up we are encouraged to label those feeling states with appropriate names. So if we are running around being really active, we might be encouraged to recognize that as being excited or overexcited. Okay, so there's a constant process of learning to define and label certain feelings and emotions, okay? But when someone asks us how do we feel, we are referring to some of that physical sensation and trying to make sense of it. Are those physical sensations, do they quite relate to an emotional state? Is there a complexity to those emotions? Are we feeling perhaps more than one emotion? And how do we reconcile that? Okay, is it always possible to reconcile that? So there are lots of things that we refer to in terms of assessing how we're feeling, but these are some interesting heat maps that show how different emotions relate to heat in different parts of the body. Okay, so you'll see that the kind of more active and happier states, there's a lot more heat generated in the body, a lot more general kind of activity within the body. And you'll see that the kind of more depressed states, sadness, and in the next slide, depression, anxiety, and shame, are much colder. Okay, so there's something going on physiologically that indicates to us that we might be experiencing a certain emotional state. Okay, and this is just one of the ways in which we interpret our emotional state, the feelings that we are feeling. And this is not an easy process, of course. This is something that we have to learn and constantly reinterpret as we grow older, how these emotions and feeling states express themselves through our body. And of course there are situations where we might experience emotions that we've never had before, okay, that might kind of knock us sideways, and we're not really sure how to interpret them, understand them, or to kind of report them to other people. So that often these feelings won't necessarily have a name, okay? They don't fit into our lexicon of emotional states. And that also makes it very difficult for us to personally deal with those emotions and to communicate to others what's going on for us. And of course, we also get what are called blocked emotions, okay? So emotions that we don't want to acknowledge because they are threatening to our sense of self. So there's a complication there in terms of how we express and understand our emotions, and we'll come back to this a bit later. Interestingly, there's some lovely work being done on cross-cultural words for different emotions, and if you look in other countries, there are kind of expressions or understandings of important emotions that we don't have in the UK, or we might use combinations of emotions or other ways of explaining those things, but they're not seen to be core emotions. And there's some lovely ones here. So have a little read through these. So the photo, for instance, is, wabi sabi, a Japanese word for a dark, desolate sublimity centered on transience and imperfection in beauty. Okay, and it's often related to nature. So there are some lovely, really interesting ways that emotion is experienced differently in different places in the world, and certain emotional states are kind of prioritized as important, whereas they might not be so much in kind of Western cultures, or even other countries have this. So even in places like Germany and Holland, they have different words for emotions, even in Scandinavia as well. So it's important here to make a distinction between emotions and moods, of course. So we do some of that same, if you like, self-analysis in trying to ascertain what mood we're in versus what emotions we're experiencing. But it's worth just kind of reiterating. So when we're talking about moods tend to be that kind of the background to experience that is more long term, okay, that it colours the way in which we interpret events in our life, and emotions might exist within a mood or in relation to a mood, but emotions tend to be more transient and often related to particular events, or swift changes of circumstance, whereas moods tend to be a kind of more deep-seated way of understanding one's life and evaluating experience. So when we're relating this to well-being, it's an important distinction, because which of these affects well-being most? Okay, I guess is the question. Moods, we know, continue beyond the kind of specific moment and tend to have a more far-reaching impact, whereas emotions can be quite short-lived. So if you're assessing well-being in the moment, you're more likely to get some kind of emotional reaction, whereas if you're asking people to think about well-being over time, you're more likely to get an assessment of mood. So now I'm going to move on to some of the kind of emotional responses that are kind of obviously coming from the body, and also ones that we know have an immediate impact on emotions and emotional experience. So you'll all be familiar with this notion of fight or flight. So I'm just going to briefly go into what that is and how this impacts on well-being. So as far back as the 1930s, this was sort of identified at a kind of physiological level, that when we're in situations that we perceive a threat in the environment, it kicks off this built-in reaction, a physiological reaction that very quickly turns into an emotional reaction. So it starts off in the amygdala, very old part of the brain, and this kind of hormonal cascade occurs, which immediately kicks into gear a bunch of physical reactions in our body. So the hormones that are released, adrenaline and norepinephrine, increase our heart rate, our blood pressure, supply blood to the muscles and away from the stomach, and also cortisol changes the blood sugar level so that we've got more energy. Okay, so the background to this reaction is an evolutionary reaction that has developed over millions of years, is to be able to evade threat, i.e. flight, or to engage with that threat. Okay, so at a certain point in our evolution, this has been a really important capacity for human beings. But of course, it has other implications now that we don't live in that same kind of environment where we have to defend ourselves all the time. So when it comes to the kind of psychological effects, we also know that these hormones have an immediate effect on how we experience the environment, the immediate environment. There tends to be a narrowing of attention so that we can no longer see kind of the big picture. We become very focused on the source of the threat and how to evade that threat. Okay, our thinking becomes quicker, so we're more able to kind of respond to that threat, and we're more likely to kind of take note of what's going on around us, to remember things, particularly new information that is important. And the kind of flip side of this is that this is also a state in which we start to become what would be called intuitive in the way that we make decisions. We become very quick at making decisions, but also that brings into play lots of built-in biases in terms of how we read situations. Okay, so that's the kind of physiological backdrop to it. And initially it was described as fight or flight. Okay, that was like the only two options. Over the years, this has kind of been more and more refined. So now we also talk about freeze, fright, flag, or faint as being reactions that take place along that if you think of fight or flight as being the kind of extreme reaction, these are also alternatives in terms of how we respond to a threat. Okay, and this will make more sense when I talk about, you know, how this is translated into modern life. Of course, in modern living, we're not having to deal with wild animals very often, or the immediate danger caused by predators. So that response, you might think, is largely redundant, but the kind of physiological aspects of it still exist. And when human beings perceive threat, even if that threat might not be the threat of someone is about to attack me, that same physiological response is kicked into gear. Okay, so that's why in modern living we are constantly being stimulated in that sense. Okay, so that kind of fear reaction is still built into us, and when things happen in our lives that kind of really threaten our sense of who we are, we still have that kind of you know, the experience of being attacked, as it were. So some of the most stressful life events that have been kind of assessed in this sense: death of a spouse, divorce, marital separation, imprisonment. We all know what that's like at the moment. Okay, so it is obviously a stressful event, and it kicks into gear these same responses: death of a close family member, personal injury, marriage, dismissal from work, marital reconciliation, and retirement. So all of these events, there's no obvious predator or immediate harm to us, but we respond as if there were. Now, fortunately, there is a counterweight to this fight or flight response, which comes through the parasympathetic nervous system. Right? The fight or flight response is related to the sympathetic nervous system, and the relaxation response is related to the parasympathetic nervous system, that counterweight. So when we feel safe, where we feel in a situation where there's space for us to repair and to no longer be fending off any kind of threat, this kicks into gear a very different kind of a process at a hormonal level and at an emotional level. And of course, quite often when we are involved in promoting well-being, this is often what we're trying to engage. Okay, we're trying to get people into this kind of relaxation response, also known as rest, digest, and restore. And it involves particular hormones, which I'll say a bit more about later on: oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin inhibits the effects of cortisol, so it reverses some of that readiness for fight or flight. And there's another hormone called vasopressin, which helps us to retain the moisture that we might have been expelling as part of exertion. And also this seems to have some function in relation to promoting a caring attitude towards others, and there's some debate about how that actually works, but it seems to play a part in that sense. So also these hormones reverse the effects that we see in the fight or flight response. They make attention wider again. They change the way in which we relate to situations, so we become less focused on any threat and more creative in our thinking. And of course they slow the heart rate, they make us less sensitive to stimuli, etc. So This is really important when we're talking about well-being, to really understand at a kind of physiological level how this is kind of feeding into our emotional state. So oxytocin has these specific psychological effects. As I said earlier, broadens attention, so we're more able to be creative and less fixated on a particular element of our environment. It opens us up to other people. Okay, so our social memory improves and our responses to other people. So we're more likely to empathise and trust the people around us when we're in this relaxed state. And of course, oxytocin is part of this kind of recuperation phase. So oxytocin has been called the cuddle hormone. Okay, so it is something that naturally occurs when we eat, particularly when we eat chocolate. It also, interestingly, happens well after we've been to the loo, during orgasm, whilst breastfeeding, cuddling your dog, as a response to random acts of kindness. So when you are kind to other people, this is something that there's a hormonal release of oxytocin. And also simply just being warm, okay, can also promote oxytocin release, and handshakes. So oxytocin is often called the cuddle hormone, but there are other happy hormones that are released in the body as part of the nervous system throughout the body. So I'm just going to talk about those as well briefly. So there's dopamine. So this is a neurotransmitter that is released in the brain in particular, but also other parts of the body, and it operates like a kind of a reward. Okay, so when dopamine is released, then we're likely to repeat that activity. Okay, so it's often related to the pleasure centers of the brain, and it stimulates feelings of euphoria, bliss, motivation, and concentration. So, for instance, we know that dopamine is released when other people like our posts on Instagram. That is the particular neurotransmitter that's involved in that kind of a process. And there's also implications for addictive behaviour, but of course the pleasure is what keeps us coming back for more. So that's dopamine. There's also serotonin, and this is mostly found in the digestive system, okay, and it regulates mood, sleep, your bowel movements, bone health, and it's responsible for a range of different feelings, from nausea to the other end of the spectrum, happiness, calmness, versus anxiety. Okay, so it's important in maintaining a kind of psychological balance in relation to one's moods. And then we've got endorphins. Okay, so endorphins are particularly present when we're involved in activity, physical activity. Okay, and they are actually a form of pain relief that is expressed within the brain, okay, to reduce feelings of pain. If you like, it's the body's own opiate, and it's associated with feelings of euphoria and bliss. So if you've gone on a really long run and you've really pushed yourself to the limit, this is probably the neurotransmitter that is washing through your brain and making you feel no pain. Okay, and that's why if you've had a really grueling workout, you only feel the pain a couple of days later. So it's a very important painkiller, if you like, in relation to activity. So these are all deemed to be happy hormones in a kind of physiological sense, and we'll see that when we look at well-being activities, the things that we do to make ourselves feel good, these kinds of hormones are always in the background and kind of regulating our emotions and our moods. So they're very important in that sense. Important to know they're there. So we have these two, if you like, competing or balancing nervous systems. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So just to kind of link these in some way to experiences you might have had, try and think of a recent stressful or unpleasant event, okay? And I want you to think about what was your physiological experience of that, okay? How did you respond? What were the physical sensations that went with this event? Okay. And did they fit with any of these descriptions? Fast and shallow breathing, your heart pumping faster, feeling that kind of butterflies in your stomach. And interestingly, how did you respond to that situation? What did you do immediately after? Did you fit into this kind of a fight or flight response? Did you feel like you needed to kind of deal with that situation through some physical activity? Or, so some of the other responses that we saw there, freeze, fright, flag, what that is in surrender, I surrender, or faint, okay? Did you deal with that situation in that kind of a way? So is it possible to understand your kind of emotional responses in terms of what's going on at a physiological level? I'll just leave you to think about that for a moment. Now, what's interesting is that one might think that it's really good thing to avoid stress, but actually it turns out that we need a certain amount of stress to be at our peak performance. So I don't know whether you've come across this before, but this is the Yerkes-Dodson eustress graph. Okay, so eustress is EU stress, and the suggestion is that there's a certain amount of stress that is really good for us, and that it kind of provokes a kind of performance in terms of once those stress hormones are flowing through our body, they actually allow us to engage with certain activities in a much more invigorated and on the ball manner. Okay. So, and I actually find this with my lectures. Okay, if I'm not anxious at all, those lectures tend to be flat as anything, and you probably experience it the same the other end. But if there's an element of anxiety, okay, that's actually really good for performing, for doing a presentation or whatever it might be. And I'm sure some of you feel that when you're writing your essays. You know, you need that certain level of stress. You need to leave it at least to the last week to start writing it, or you're not going to kind of deliver in the same level. And that's how it feels. Okay. And then we know that there's this point where it tips over. So the level of stress that we're experiencing starts to bring in fatigue, exhaustion, and ultimately that can be really counterproductive. So over time, we know that can be really detrimental. So the flip side of trying to get to an optimum state of performance is that extended stressful emotions and an extended stressful situation can have real knock-on effects, and some have called this the exhaustion funnel. Okay, where we start to feel the physical fatigue, and that starts to get into other things that we do. We start to have problems sleeping. It brings in other emotions where we're kind of struggling with how we deal with that stress, and at the same time the stress itself becomes a threat to us. Okay, so it's a kind of self-perpetuating cycle. So it's really important when we're thinking about well-being that we kind of take note of this, and that, okay, yeah, stress might be useful up to a certain point, but we need to know at which point it tips over into a cause of exhaustion. Okay, so just to wind down after our discussion of stress, think about a recent pleasant event, okay? Something that you've done that you've really enjoyed and it's made you feel, spot on. Do you recall the kind of physical experience that went with that? So you might have labelled that in your mind as being content, happy, ecstatic, whatever the emotion might be. But do you also recall any of that physical aspect that went with it? So your breathing slowing down, your ability to not be completely focused on one thing, but to be open and more creative in your thinking. Did you feel your body as less of a pressure on you? And possibly you had more appetite. Okay, that's another indicator there's something physiological going on there. So that's all for the first part. Okay, so we've gone through some of the physiological background to some of the emotions that we might be feeling. And then in the second part, I'm going to be looking at emotional intelligence. So how we learn to deal with the emotions that we experience and label them appropriately, and how we deal with other people. Okay, that's all for now. See you in part 2.